let's go ahead and get started. And I just want to say thanks to everybody who's been with us for now coming on the third hour. I hope you've enjoyed this little mini masterclass and listened to some different perspectives on employee experience or the human experience of work. I'm going to present now and share some more research and case studies. And before I begin, I just want to get a sense of who's on the call. So if you could in the chat, write where you are today, what city or city and country, and one or two words that describe your role. So if we could just, let's have a little introduction to the people who are on the call with us here. So just write, where are you today? And something about your role. Wendy Branch is in Bedford, New York, head of global talent for Visa. And Bedford is one of the most beautiful towns in the United States, if you've never been there. Jane Rokshaw, London global director. Thank you, Jane. I'm not going to read everyone's, but I'm just noting the ones that are there. Thank you so much. This is fun. Geese is in Johannesburg. Fantastic. Workforce planning. Debbie's in Fort Lee, New Jersey. Great. Chris is in Cheshire in the UK. And Chris is part of our branch. There are a global network of EX heads. So Erica is in Laeken, Switzerland. So I'm in Zurich myself. So we're just down the road here. Marion is in Dusseldorf. Thanks so much. Great. This is fun. All right. Kevin's in Brussels today and developing his own company in EX. So great. Nice to have you, Kevin. Hope this is enjoyable for you. All right, let's go ahead and get started. I appreciate your being here. I just want to give you a little bit of on Micah's in Utrecht. Fantastic. I lived and worked in the Netherlands for 5 years. Loved it. Love the Netherlands. Okay, so I'm going to share my presentation here and we'll get started. And again, if you have any questions, please type them in the chat or unmute yourselves and you can ask me directly. I want to share a little bit about what I think is, first of all, the origin story for EX, or as we're calling it, the human experience of work. Where did all of this come from? What do we think is a framework? And this is an open source. This is not, this is trying to be as open-minded as possible about how all of this works, but some things that we've seen in terms of frameworks and skills that make up employee experience, and also some examples of how this has been applied. So some case studies of different companies. Just to close off today, you've heard ABN AMRO and their view on analytics and how Patrick has built up that function there. You've heard from Steelcase talking about some really interesting things post-pandemic. Let me give you a little preview of what you'll see with the recording of Martijn. Now, Martijn is one of the few that has done this role 3 times. There aren't too many out there. It's rare to find anybody who's done it more than 1 time, in fact. So, and Martijn has done it, I think, really nicely because he approached this with a lot of curiosity, very open to the idea of what is this thing called employee experience, and then went about to really learn some interesting skills. So Martijn has taken courses in design thinking. He's gotten very close to analytics, and he's a firm believer of what we were talking about earlier about the very critical role of analytics in all of this. And he's also become certified as an agile coach. Design thinking, as we'll talk about a little bit later, is really good at identifying problems, but not so good at producing prototypes and solutions. That's where agile comes in. So if you have that balance of design thinking and agile in your background, it really helps support what you're doing. And Martijn also has a very good view, having done this before. What's the strategy of EX in a company? And what capabilities do you need to set up in there? And how do you get senior leaders on board with all of this? So kind of the change approach, if you will, for EX. Nayara has done this also for many, many years, for, well, I should say 5 years, which is about as long as anyone has in this practice. And she also went about it in a very diligent way, learning some key things around design thinking and analytics, and has also built a different kind of example of this at Randstad in Spain. So both of those are really good examples of EX leaders that I like to put forward. So with that, let me go ahead and share my presentation. So can everybody see this? Does this work?
Yes.
Okay, great. So these are the 5 presentations you'll find. I want to tell you a little bit about who I am, who we are, and what we do. So 5 years ago, when I first heard of this thing called employee experience, I really wanted to understand, what is it? How does it work? How is it different? And who are the people who have this first knowledge, this first know-how of how to do this? Real quickly, my background, I've been over 20 years in corporate roles. I was 4 times ahead of talent, and I also had org design and org development in my role, or a transformation component, let's say. So these were in businesses that were large corporates that were doing a business transformation, usually an integration, and they did not have an integrated or global approach to talent management. So it made it difficult, for example, to assess and move talent around the business. That was the kind of the problem statement back then. So I worked at Siemens in Munich. I was at Novartis in Basel. I was at AkzoNobel in the Netherlands, a big chemical and paints company. And then my last corporate role as head of learning at Pfizer in New York City. So lived in the US and Europe and worked for German, Swiss, Dutch, and Japanese companies in there. So this really appealed to me from the idea of, this is more from the bottom up. It's not so much enforced from the top down, which is the way we always created anything from recruiting or onboarding or performance management. So I wanted to understand how this was done and who was doing it well. And I started to go out and interview companies who were starting in this. I'll talk about this in the origin story in a minute. But what we've collected over the years is a global community of people who are like Patrick, like some of these others, who are doing a current role full time, who lend their time to doing this work as coaches and some of these expertise areas. So transformation strategy, teaching design thinking and service design, et cetera, being agile and lean coaches, people who understand people analytics and the intersection with employee experience, and also the digital experience of work. So this is where this pool of people come in that we've gotten to know, that we apply to this. And they do a couple of things with this. We also have a framework that we've built, I'll share in a minute, which is the Hx Playbook. We do experience management and coaching on how to build your own employee experience or Hx Playbook in your organization, how to adapt these tools and methods to your organization, and how to create a digital platform that supports this, and then coaching for the transformation that's around this, because as many of you know, there's a lot of work around change, right? Second thing we do with this group of experts is we teach people how to do this. So we have these different modules. I'll show an example of this and share my slides, but there are badges you can earn via subscription for your role and also for different applications. And next year, we want to build out of this also a new platform for all HX related jobs. So companies can find talent and skills in this, and those who are in this community can find either contract work or full-time work. One of the questions we get asked quite often by CHROs or new heads of EX is, what are what are the first 3 roles that I should hire? And can you share a job description with me? So these types of questions are really key. And I think there's a big opportunity to support that even better. So on the learning certification and badges, what we do is, as I said, we have a foundational program that introduces the playbook. And then we have some courses that are built for different roles. So what is the role of a sponsor or stakeholder? What is the role of a product owner? Now, product owner in our current way of thinking could be somebody like a head of learning or a head of talent acquisition. Those are product owners within HR that we're familiar with. And the idea is you get people who touch that experience outside of your functional area, like with regard to talent acquisition. Maybe it's somebody digital that helps set up the digital tools someone needs who's starting a job. Maybe it's someone from communications, from facilities, et cetera. Those are the people on a product team. So how do you lead that team? Head of HX, I'll share with you in a minute that almost 90% of people who are head of EX or HX started their job in the last 2 years, and most of them had no prior experience. So how do you set up that role? And I mentioned the people analytics course that Patrick has designed. And then we also have programs to develop for you in your organization, people who can become coaches of the transformation, who understand how all of this works, but can also, from a coaching perspective, be able to coach leaders through this. So that's the idea there. This network, so we have every quarter, we get together as heads of EX. This is an invitation only, but if you're a head of EX and you're interested in joining, please talk to me. We get together and talk about current projects, what tools or methods are you using, what tech are you using, and we have different questions. Like we've had one in the past recently about how are you designing hybrid work. And tomorrow we're talking also about some topics that are very current. So we get people together and they have a direct exchange. And I also help introduce and do some matchmaking if somebody has a particular problem to solve. So hang on just a second. And then we have, so tomorrow we're doing our virtual summit. And we have 40 companies all the way around the world, different industries, different locations, different stages of development. So it's a fascinating group of people. You can find out some more about our in-person network events. So we're visiting different cities, and future events will be under hxtransforma.com. So that's where you can find some more information. That's where you registered for this one. A little bit about our research. So we're adding all the time to our website different research studies. We've done 5 years running of different global surveys and case studies and trends. These are the case studies that we have a case library of, and we'll be starting our new survey, our new global survey next Monday. So we'll have a new report out in the autumn in September. Also, we're writing a book about the playbook and how it all works. And this is a wiki effort with this community, global community of people that we know in design thinking and EX, et cetera. Okay, so a little bit about what it is and how it works. So I know that all of you have maybe a slightly different definition of employee experience or the human experience of work. One of the definitions that we like is about how people feel. So it has to deal with emotions, the emotional impact that we have from the people, the culture, and the environments, the context where we work. But the idea of the human experience of work is really about this idea of the emotions. The reason why I favor human experience of work over employee experience is, first of all, we're not all employees. Some of us are contract workers or other types of workers. And I think it's time to move beyond the idea that the organization owns us. There's this idea in the past of human capital, but we're really human beings. Each one of us has our own thoughts and feelings. And what makes us unique and diverse is that emotional side of who we are. So this is the origin story of the HX of work. And I think this is really a lot of fun. This came about because somebody asked me a few years ago, where did all this come from? And what proof is there that some of the things you talk about, like design thinking, have ever made any difference in the world, ever had any impact? And I was flying home and I read in the New York Times an obituary about a man named Lawrence Kessler. And if any of you have ever seen the movie Forrest Gump, Lawrence Kessler is like the Forrest Gump of tech. He was part of the Xerox PARC team that Steve Jobs recruited to create the first Macintosh, Apple Macintosh. They created the first mouse. They created the first white screen. We used to call this WYSIWYG, or what you see is what you get. He developed the idea of copy paste. He created the first Wi-Fi system. And he had created also the operating system for mobile devices, which we have. He was the first one ever to use a laptop in an airport and an airplane. So this guy really was the Forrest Gump. So he was part of this team that came around back in the early 80s. So there's this line of origin within HX of work that comes from design thinking, or what we call user experience. Don Norman is another pioneer. Don Norman, if you go on YouTube and Google or search for Don Norman, he has some excellent videos explaining what is design and design thinking and UX. He also was there at the beginning. The cool thing about what they did, and this is why where it comes into relevance, is that Lawrence Kessler, when he developed some of these ideas, he would interview ordinary people or observe how they did work and try to define what is the problem you're trying to solve and what is it that you're trying to do. Let's understand the context. So for example, he interviewed the front office secretary, the receptionist, and asked her, when you type a paper, how do you do it? And what are you trying to do? What's the goal that you have? And that's how the whole idea of copy paste came along, or the idea that we see on a computer screen today, a white page. And he used to grab the delivery people literally off the street and say, can you sit down and try out this new thing that we have called a mouse? And how intuitive is this? So I'm taking notes while you're doing this. That's how the whole idea of design thinking came about, was this idea of developing new tech and new products. And along with that, what they had was called the computer for the rest of us. So this was back in a transition when computers were for tech geeks and not for ordinary people like myself or maybe you. They wanted to make this accessible and understandable for everyone. Then you had another line, which was agile. So this started with Kanban back in the 1940s, with Lean and Scrum and Sprint in the 90s. And then you had the Agile Manifesto, which came out in late 2001. And then you have also these roots of analytics and behavioral science. Some of these we know about, right? Market segmentation, psychographics, psychology, sociology. All of these things are part of what we have today, which is called the user experience, or now customer experience, which really came about 10 years ago, 12 years ago. So even that branch is not very old. And then in 2017, a man by the name of Mark Levy joined Airbnb. And the two CEOs of Airbnb said, we've heard about this thing called HR. We don't want anything like that here. What we want to do is preserve our culture, because we're growing rapidly and we need to keep our culture and grow with the business. So could you create something that works a bit like Disney, where you have storyboards and experience maps and things like that? And he said, why don't we call it employee experience, referring to the idea of customer experience, but for inside the organization. He's the first one to use that term and the first head of EX, Mark Levy, in 2017. We're in 2022, so that's only 5 years. So that's a bit of the origin story about about EX or HX now. Business case, I like to say, and I'll pause after this because I want to hear your inputs here, but people ask all the time, what's the business case of this? Why is this so important to do something in a new way? I think the first thing that's quite strong that comes out, thinking about what Patrick shared earlier, we get better data. With design thinking, our goal is to fall in love with the problem, really be data-driven, and to use better questions and more qualitative methods to really understand what drives behavior and decisions. So getting better data is a big part of this. A big goal of having the data, and somebody mentioned earlier and in the day, experience maps. If you can identify moments that matter and get insights on how people evaluate their touch points and their experience, it helps us to prioritize. And when we can prioritize out of all of the things we're doing, it helps us to put our resources in the right places. So I remember working with a group at Allianz in IT a few years ago, and they were sharing how their IT group every year launched over 100 new products. And we talked about the value of bringing and doing some design thinking with them. And our proposal was, what if we could show you out of those 100 projects, which 2 or 3 are the most important? Wouldn't you like to have some prioritization for that? And I don't think HR is that far off. I think we have many, many projects throughout the year. How do we know where to put our resources and our money and our people? Another third thing is that if we work in these cross-functional product teams that I was talking about, and work in that multifunctional way, it really helps us to become more efficient. What's been missing as we've been talking about working across silos in the last 20, 30 years is we haven't had a really strong purpose to this. And the organization of these product teams gives us that strong sense of purpose. So the impact of all of this, or the outcome, is it gives us big business impact and competitive advantage. If we can find out what makes us work better and find out what makes us different and unique, instead of always using benchmarks and comparing and driving sameness, then we can drive real competitive advantage and try to get at something that is more unique and giving us the advantage. I'm going to stop there for just a second, and because I'm not able to show the presentation and answer questions, but any comments or questions or observations maybe that you've had in similar kinds of areas? How many of you heard this origin story or something similar? Is this interesting? Yeah, I don't mention work. Well, it's inferred, right, Wendy? But it is how we get work done, right? It's talking about how it feels to work here, and how the work is also impacted by all these other environmental things and the people and culture. But that's a great observation. Okay, I'm going to go back to sharing my screen, and if I'm talking on too long and you have a question, please interrupt me. Maybe you can unmute and make a comment for me. I'm just going to jump ahead here. This is one about moments that matter, and I know many of you share this feeling, but one of the key things that you want to be able to focus on that will help you get to that prioritization, and that should be the point of your data, is to understand what are the moments that matter. And there are many definitions about moments that matter, but one of them for me that I like is that it's a point in time that fundamentally changes how we feel about an organization and about working there. So it leaves a lasting emotional impression on how we feel about the people and the organization and our relationship with them, to the extent that if it's a positive one, you literally do anything for them, right? So, and it's usually in a moment that is really critical. So a moment that matters cannot be ordinary. One of the stories, maybe if you've heard me talk about this before, but I think often when we're traveling, this becomes a big issue. And sometimes when I've many stories about when I've been traveling and somebody who's been in the airline, in the company that I'm flying with, they'll notice something and they'll suggest a solution that is coming just at the right moment where I'm super stressed. I'm trying to move my family or people that I care about, and they pick up on something with an idea and they say, here's an idea. I've just noticed you were struggling with this. Here's something you can do, and it takes care of it. And in that moment, I am the most loyal customer. And I think all of us have moments or examples of customer experiences that we have where somebody has done something for us that fundamentally changes our loyalty. That's what it's all about, how we feel and our ability to, our willingness to do much more and sacrifice for them. So this one I've also shared in a few places. There might be a number of you who are new, but people have told me they like this example, so I'm going to share this. This is kind of contrasting the way we've traditionally done things with the way that is a newer way with employee experience. And I'll go back and use a story from when I was working before, where I had responsibility for performance management, and my team designed performance management for an organization of 80,000 employees in 100 countries and many different business units. We defined what the problem was at the top, and we set out as this small team to say, what are the rating systems we're going to use? What are the labels for those rating systems? What's the IT system that's going to support all of this? And we even got into the weeds about what should the different buttons say and what's different in different languages in a way that feels encouraging and positive for people. What's the timing for this? What's the bonus and percent increase tied with different levels of performance, et cetera? So we define all of this at the top. And then we designed based on these benchmarks that we had. And we told the business units and the regions, this is the way we will all do performance management and the timing in which we will do it. And what did we do to measure the effectiveness? We measured compliance. How many people were setting goals? How many people were on the system? Maybe this sounds familiar. That's still, I think, what a lot of our large enterprise systems do for us. They don't measure necessarily whether or not performance is improved, but how many people are doing it the way we prescribed. And what we get out of all of this, or what I got, was we had the original design. We didn't make too many changes, even though we had many, many meetings with the different countries and business units. And I should say, we produced a 125-page master document to describe how it would all work, as the way to say, this is the owner's manual of performance management, 125 pages. So, anyway, what you get is something that's very complete, but it's untested. So what happens this way is you say, for example, let's study when and how we do our best work. Let's look at how and where people, what are the situations, what's the context for this? So for example, when we've worked with companies on performance management, we've had their product teams. So these consist of people from management, even senior management, and people who are designing the system, people or IT and digital systems owners. Anyone who touches that experience is part of that product team. And they sit and they listen to end users, if you will, the people who have used the product of performance management, describe how it is for them. what's it like when you're setting goals? Just tell us about a time when you were trying to understand a project. How did you understand the goal setting? How did you understand what was important, the priorities for this? Talk us through that process. So you get people to tell more of the narrative for that. So you study how this works. And then as you understand that and go through and build personas and experience maps or journey maps of the performance process, you start to identify what works well and what are the moments that matter. I'll share a little bit later an example of an experience map. And then as you start to identify the moments that matter and key touch points, then you can focus on and develop and test new prototypes based on those priorities. And then after that, you create the strategy. So the strategy is supporting the implementation of it and how it's going to go out into the organization. Here you start with a strategy. Here you do the strategy only after you know what will work well. So you keep on testing and improving. So there's iteration. And what you end up with over here is a solution that's a prototype. So it's an 80% minimum viable product, or as some call it, a minimum lovable product, but it's been tested. Here it's been untested, over here you're tested. So that's, if anyone is wanting to know what's the difference between the current way of doing things and this EX way, this is one approach. So another basic way to say is, I share this sometimes with pharma or research companies that we work with. We research what works. We start to segment into end users, identify their problems, the context, and then we design the journeys after that, after we understand what works, and then we prototype and test and launch. So there's kind of a three-stage process. And in designing journeys, we're also first mapping the current journey and understanding what is important to people before we get into the redesign. So out of all of this, out of the years of research and case studies and coaching that we've done, we've come to understand that three of the most important elements in employee experience, or HX, are these three. So the first one is design thinking. And design thinking, the goal really is to help you understand the right problems. And if you're working with a product team, you're seeing the same problem in the same way. So that's the advantage of working in product teams. We also put a high reliance on analytics. So these are some examples of analytics that we do at the beginning to, as Patrick talked about, surface key themes and topics people are talking about. So if you're looking at onboarding, how are people talking about the onboarding experience? How is it different by function, by demographic, by job level, et cetera? And looking at the relationship of topics to one another. This helps you to create personas and understand drivers and motivators for personas. A third area that we think the framework is important is in the area of agile. And the goal there is you want to work as a product team and really prototype new solutions. This is the playbook. So taking those three things, you can see these going across here from left to right. You see the different stages that you do. Now, many of you, especially in Europe, are familiar with the double diamond approach. It's not quite so prevalent in the US, but maybe some of my American friends know this one as well. The British Design Council came up with this double diamond, and these two diamonds on the right are essentially those same diamonds. So where you're empathizing and defining and ideating and prototyping. We've added an additional diamond at the beginning because it's to emphasize the idea that we need to do more research and problem identification before we jump into solutioning. So you can see what we do at each stage. In the first diamond, we're listening and segmenting users. We're mapping personas, pain points, key behaviors. In the second diamond, we're mapping experiences, noting actions, emotions, and also how do we support those experiences? So the front and backstage actions. And then we're identifying moments that matter and rating the touch points, and noting the problems to solve. In the last diamond, we're crowdsourcing ideas. We're doing hackathons and we're ideating and prototyping and creating a backlog, a product backlog. And then the last stage, we're doing sprints, we're pitching to the business, and we're building and testing those prototypes. So I'll send this to you. You can also see on our website, I have a downloadable PDF of this called the HX Playbook and Toolkit. The book that we're writing is an expansion on all of these. So it's kind of an open source. So if you wanted to do kind of a how-to, even facilitation for each one of these things in your team, what's the main concept? What's the research tool, for example? How would you facilitate a session to use that or design the research to do it? And then how could you execute that? And then some case examples. That's the idea behind the book that we're writing. And then I'm going to actually skip over this because this shows what Patrick was talking about. But the main idea with analytics is start listening, love the problem, and then the third diamond, try a solution. So there are all these different different steps here that you can look at that are part of things that you can do in terms of methodology at each stage. There's also some really great books on design thinking and service design and mapping experiences that I'll share. I have a bibliography that's part of this that I'll share in my slide deck. Because I definitely don't think I'm the original of all of this. I like to be the storyteller or the one who's purveying it or making it accessible. So one of the key ideas with data is that you're trying to use a balance of quantitative and qualitative. And we like to say that you use qualitative to kind of set up, oops, let me go back here, to set up quantitative. So remember what Patrick was saying, that you could ask 3 questions. How would you recommend, how would you give, what's the NPR, the net promoter score that you would give to this particular experience? And can you give us some description of how well this worked for you? What was going well? And can you give us some indication of what we could improve? And if you take those 3 data points and combine them and put them on a matrix, you can see what are the top, how do people talk about these things? And are they talking about them in a positive or negative way relative to net promoter score, et cetera? So we really like to do, first of all, this qualitative because that helps us identify what questions we do in quantitative. So I gave some examples here of something we do with hybrid work. Please tell me about a typical day. How and where do you do your best work? What works well for you? Where do you go to get support? These types of things. And when people identify those priorities for you, then you can start to say, okay, I'm going to list them here on the left, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Could you rank them in order of importance? And then you send that survey out to 1,000 people or 10,000 people. So you can use the first 10 or 20 to help surface the ideas. The quantitative survey you can use as a way to validate and scale it to a much larger audience. That's one of the tips that we use in analytics. So also with regard to with understanding the experience people have, one of the things that's really hard for us in HR, I say this as a former owner of some of these things, is to not kind of jump in and start solving the problem for people or say, didn't you know about this website? Or did you know that it's supposed to work that way? It's very natural for us to do that. We also can't pitch or talk about how we want it to work or hypothetically or in the future. Our goal mainly in the research stage is just to sit with it and ask questions and say, tell me about a time that you did this. And listen for opportunities to dig deeper and tell me more. Those of you who do coaching, we do this in coaching, right? It's called active listening or coactive listening. And do things like ask why 5 times till you get to the real bottom of this. These are some things we go into in more detail in some of the the training programs that I mentioned earlier. So again, this is kind of we like a semi-structured approach. Semi because you want to be able to be open to listening and follow-up questions. Structured because you want to have basic questions you ask everyone to build data. So I'm going to skip this one and I'm going to go to here. So this is an example of an experience map. 2 years ago, and I think Wendy, you saw, I think I shared this with you maybe, but 2 years ago in the fall of 2020, we did workshops with more than 20 locations worldwide with HR leaders and just asked them about their own experience of working from home. So think about when you were fully working from home, you had no possibility to go to the office, but you still had to get the same amount of work done. That was a challenging place to be, right? So this is an experience map from one of those groups. And if you look at this here, what are some things that you notice here in the top half in the gray area? What do you notice? I don't know if you can see this well enough, but what do you see there? This is a typical day. And you'll probably have to unmute because I can't read the comments while I'm sharing the screen.
Yeah, Guy speaking. So I think what's clear is a lot of integration, I think, between family life and yeah, your work. So it's all happening in parallel.
Yeah, it is. It is. So there's a lot of personal life and work life mixed in. What I didn't put on this is that when they started and when they finished their day. So the typical day when people were describing their start here was around 5:30 or 6 in the morning. And the typical finish was close to midnight or later. So they were working 18 hours from start to finish. So what I think is really cool about experience map like this is you get that complete context. What we're missing a lot of times with our solutioning is that, or even our prototyping or our design period, is we don't understand what else was going on for them when they were doing this, right? I have another one about mobility and international transfers. A lot of times when we talk about international assignments and moving people, we miss what's happening with their family. What are their children going through? If they have teenagers, how are they handling the change in school? What's the other spouse, the other partner or spouse doing if they have to find work in a new place? Huge impact on family systems and people that people are caring for. It's the same thing here, right? We did journey maps. We did some work with AstraZeneca last year on parental leave. And we talked about first or second time mothers. We interviewed adoptive parents. We interviewed the non-birth parent. And each of them had their own experience maps where we had 15 to 20 people inputting on these. The business had no idea about the sacrifice people were making to adopt or to have a baby at the same time they were trying to get all their work done. And I suspect it's the same thing here. Would Elon Musk or Jamie Dimon say some of the garbage they've been saying this past week about getting everybody back to work if they knew what people were actually doing? I don't think so. So it's insulting to tell people that you have to come back to work when you look at this and realize they're actually doing a lot of work right now on top of everything else. So over 60% of companies during 2020 saw a rise in productivity. So how do we account for that? So also, yeah, go ahead.
Sorry for interrupting. Can I ask you a question? what about burnout rates? I've read a lot of articles that increased a lot. And of course, not solely depending on remote working, what has been going on in the world. However, when I see this list, right, I'm really wondering how I did it before COVID. Because if these are all the activities my family and myself, we undertake, I must be exhausted. So isn't it true that we take on more now we work remotely? And isn't it true that burnout rates have not been higher than ever before?
It really points out, yeah, I think you're right. It also points out what a lot of companies have started to understand in the last few years about wellness and mental health, right? How do we manage all of this at once? So it's, yeah, no, you make an excellent point, Daphne. So
yeah, maybe, can I say, this is Aga, I fully, that Daphne exactly answered my thoughts at the same moment. I feel like we all have been doing it before. It's just, it got visibility and transparency how people, women at work were managing. Again, I'm not women, yes, in terms of family as well, but all of us have many topics we've been dealing with. So it just gave transparency to this. Because when you say people now go back to work, yes, for many leaders, people feel like, okay, go back to work, because exactly all those things were done before, and it is a momentum to address those.
No,
and I agree with Aga, right? Because what she said, when we go back to work, when we go back to the office, right, we focus on work. And now our days are completely mixed with private priorities and work priorities. So this really helps me putting up the question up front, right? How wise is it to work remotely?
It's helping us to acknowledge a lot of the different types of pressures and things that exist there, right? One of the companies that I'm aware of did they have 30 plus businesses. They asked people, they identified people by who they were taking care of in the home during 2020. So are you taking care of aging parents? Do you have a new baby? Are you by yourself? Do you have someone who's ill? And they segmented out the pains and gains and different objectives of those people. And then they segmented their communication and their solutions for those different types of personas in that way. So it's very interesting. I think we're just learning how to do all of this better and be more aware. I think that's the main point, is be aware, so that we can talk about is help the leaders that we advise, that we coach on communication, help them be aware of what's going on. What are people dealing with in the office? What more is happening at home? A couple of things that I really like to promote too is when you're doing experience maps, you notice here below pains and gains, we try to find out, and these come from, like I say, live workshops on Zoom or in person. Think about for each stage or each touch point, what's the goal that someone has? And we like to help people frame it as a question. So in the first part of the day, it's how can I start organized? Then it's how can I make sure my kids are successful? What kind of help does my team need, et cetera? And then they rate these touch points. The first number, and they're both on a scale of 5. So the first number is rate the experience, kind of like an NPR, but a 5-point NPR. On a scale of 1 to 5, how well did it go for you? How well did it go for you in getting organized during the beginning of your day? The second number that you see there is how important was it to you? So you get a fraction like that says, well, it was a 3 out of a 4 or a 2 out of a 4. That helps us pay attention, because you want to pay attention to the things that the people rate the highest, right? And where do they see the biggest gap? Like here or here. The red dots are where they voted, they selected as moments that matter. So this group of people in this workshop, I think it was San Francisco, said they wanted to make sure their kids are successful. That was the most important thing for them. Secondly was what kind of help does their team need? And also, how can I have enough time for me? So when we were talking earlier about priority, if you could create an experience map that helps to rate the experiences or the touch points and identify moments that matter, now I've got 3 things here. If I'm creating a product backlog, that's where I start. Those 3 things are where I go into ideation and prototyping. And that's a good indicator of going from this big picture of understanding the context to understanding the problems to solve to understanding what priorities for those. So that's an example of a journey map. Let me just finish off on this here. I have just a couple more slides to go, but I've been watching LinkedIn over the last 5 years on these roles relating to experience. And as I said earlier, they've literally come out of nowhere to where you have thousands and even what we can see over 1 million people who have these roles somewhere in their title: experience, agile, or people analytics. So, and you can see here how recently they started. So some of these are very, very new, right? So it's very similar to what you saw with user experience. This comes from Don Norman, who tracks user experience. Back in the 1950s, that began, and now you have somewhere around over 1 million people who are doing this role as well. So, and I've also looked at when did they start? So if you have experience in your title, I'm talking about employee experience. If you have the term employee experience or people experience or something similar, 85% of these people that we see on LinkedIn started since January 2020. So that's not even 2 years, right? And at the same time, if I look back at what they describe as what they were doing before, nowhere is it mentioned about experience design or design thinking or CX or UX or any of these kind of roots that feed into experience. These people were all doing, or most of them were doing generalist roles or talent roles, a COE, or they came from engagement or one of these other areas. Not even very many came from consulting, which is surprising. So it's challenging. It means that it's hard for them to know where to apply and be able to build success in what they're trying to do. Even with analytics people, most of these people have been new in their role since 2018. The difference that I find is that in analytics and agile, they do have prior background. They were doing machine learning or advanced analytics or statistics or an academic role in analytics. So we need to do a lot more to support our people who are doing employee experience. So these are some other statistics that I'll share here that talks about the urgency, where they are in terms of maturity. And this last one I'll share about which journeys are being mapped. This is a model that we borrowed actually from IBM and Microsoft and some other companies. We like this because the journeys that have to do with work, you kind of get close, as you get closer to the human in the center, these are the journeys or experiences that have the most emotional impact. So the work journeys have to do with how we get things done. Things like performance management, physical workspace, digital workspace, things that have to do with growth, have to do with development and learning and mobility and coaching. Things that have to do with living, have to do with working from home or becoming a parent. It's where we involve other people that mean the most to us. And here at the bottom, you can see a breakdown of where companies the last 2 years have been spending their time mapping journeys and the growth of some of these new journeys around remote work, et cetera. So, sorry, I didn't get time to get to these cases, but you can read these as well in here, and I'll end there. But these are a couple places I think that where we can apply the toolkit that we're, I think, just beginning to learn how to do this well. One is with hybrid ways of working. Another is application to org design and transformation. How much better could an org design or a business transformation go if we did more research, segmented users, and tried to map the experiences and then improve on those, et cetera. So, and then the last question is, where would you like to try all of this? Let me just stop there. Sorry, I've gone a little bit long, but any questions or anything before we close today?
Nothing but thank you, Elliot. So I'll definitely share also your wisdom internally in our company.
Oh, glad to help. And Wendy, we do have lots of examples of using it for performance management. It's actually a great set of tools. And I was just talking to someone in Zurich here today about a use case for that. So maybe we could connect on that. All right, well, if you have anything that you would like to ask that we didn't get to today, please feel free to reach out to me. And I can also, if you have questions about how other companies are doing some of these things, if you'd like to get some more specific examples and some inspiration, tell me what you're looking for, and I'd be happy to connect you with somebody out there who's doing something in this field that can be helpful. But I love this work because I feel like it's helping us to be more human in the workplace and focus on all of us as real people and make work better, make it work better. I think that's the main goal. So I appreciate all the work that you're doing and wish you well. And thanks for joining us today, and look forward to seeing you the next time.
Thank you. Thank you, Elliot, for organizing.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.
Bye.
All the best.